gone for it. Now, obviously, biology and medicine are not responsible themselves for creating AI, but at the same time, AI is a creation of STEM generally, science, technology, engineering, and math. And so it is important to recognize that now that this thing exists as a product of the many things that STEM has done, we have to reckon with the ethics of it. So I know I've been talking about AI a lot, but it keeps cropping up in unexpected ways and very interesting things to discuss with it. So you know what? We'll do another one for sure here. Coming from nature, this particular one falls under the heading of science fiction. Though not literally so science fiction as you think, because obviously it's in nature. But science fiction in the sense like it could have come from a science fiction storyline or something along that line. A landmark moment. Scientists use AI to design antibodies from scratch. Modified protein design tool could make it easier to tackle challenging drug targets, but AI antibodies are still a long way from reaching the clinic. Now, what do I mean by this? They don't necessarily mean that the antibodies that they produce are literally AI, but rather that they are designed by AI instead. But let us get into that just a little bit. Researchers have used generative artificial intelligence to help them make new antibodies for the first time. The proof of principle work reported this week in a preprint on bioRxiv raises the possibility of bringing AI-guided protein design to the therapeutic antibody market, which is worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Antibodies, immune molecules that strongly attach to proteins implicated in disease, have conventionally been made using brute force approaches that involve immunizing animals or screening vast numbers of molecules. AI tools that can shortcut those costly efforts have the potential to, quote, democratize the ability to design antibodies, end quote, says study co-author Nathaniel Bennett, a computational biochemist at the University of Washington in Seattle. Quote, 10 years from now, this is how we're going to be designing antibodies. Quote, it's a really promising piece of research, end quote, that represents an important step in applying AI protein design to making new antibodies, says Charlotte Dean, an immunoinformatician at the University of Oxford in the UK. So, like I said, the idea for this is not that you would be creating the antibodies per se, but rather that you would be designing them using AI. And this is all well and good. But I do want to make a point here in that remember always that AI is a model. It is entirely dependent upon the data it is trained on. And so it will always suffer from the aspect of surprise. If something happens that it has never been found in its particular training data set, it's not going to know necessarily what to do with it. In that kind of thing. It doesn't have the capacity for imagination the way that people do. The other thing with relying on a model too much is forgetting that models can be wrong. And so when you're talking about AI with this kind of thing, what does being wrong potentially mean is a concern. And so that's where I come back to the ethics side of it. And frankly, from the scientific part of it, particularly with medicine, because this would fall into the avenue of medicine, there has not been enough discussion of the ethics of how much should we rely on AI, should we rely on AI at all, or should it be a complementary tool? I have not seen enough discussion of the ethics of it, implications of it, and certainly with the issues we've already highlighted with the publications issues at this point with peer review, there needs to be tremendous amounts of discussion of that before this goes too much further. But unfortunately, I don't see it happening right now, which is frustrating in the nth degree. So, this is a problem for sure. Making mini proteins. Bennett and his colleagues used an AI tool that their team released last year that helped to transform protein design. The tool, called RF diffusion, allows researchers to design mini proteins that can strongly attach to another protein of choice. Another protein of choice. And if it's something strange. But these custom proteins bear no resemblance to antibodies, which recognize their targets by way of floppy loops that have proved difficult to model with AI. Again, they said the word right there, model. Models are never perfect things. To overcome this, a team co-led by computational biophysicist David Baker and computational biochemist Joseph Watson, both at the University of Washington, modified RF diffusion. The tool is based on a neural network similar to those used by image-generating AIs such as Midjourney and DALL-E. The team fine-tuned the network by training it on thousands of experimentally determined structures of antibodies attached to their targets, as well as real-world examples of other antibody-like interactions. Okay. For one thing, these are not image-generating, they're image-regenerating. I very much agree with the concepts that Kieran has put out and Gary McManus has put out, and that image-generating AIs is the wrong name for it. It's an image-regenerating AI. Why? What does it do? Because what you have going on is that it basically chunks up parts of images tagged with particular things, and therefore, when it is asked to create an image of something, it's just pulling in all of those little chunks and regenerating an image based upon what it is trained on. It is not necessarily creating an entirely new image. It's creating something based upon all of the stuff it is trained with. And likewise here, that would be the same thing with this. It's being trained on pre-existing structures and pre-existing interactions, real world, or what's in their particular data set here. That means whatever it generates is a regenerated thing, not a new thing in the slightest. Using this approach, researchers designed thousands of antibodies that recognize specific regions of several bacterial and viral proteins, including those of the SARS-CoV-2 and the influenza virus used to invade cells, and a cancer drug target. So SARS-CoV-2, for those who don't remember, is the virus that actually causes COVID-19. They then made a subset of their designs in the laboratory and tested whether the molecules could bind to the right targets. Watson says that 1 in 100 antibody designs worked as hoped, a lower success rate than the team now achieves with other types of AI-designed protein. The researchers determined the structure of one of the influenza antibodies using a technique called cryo-electron microscopy, and found that it recognized the intended portion of the target protein. Okay. This is what I factor under the creepy variety here. Using a computer to design proteins related to medicine like this. Again, my question is, what if it's even a tiny bit wrong over time? What's going to happen? What's going to happen if you design a protein off a model that is wrong? This is where I get concerned. Early proof of principle. A handful of companies are already using generative AI to help develop antibody drugs. Probably regenerative AI is probably the more better way to say it, but anyway. Baker and Watson's team hopes that RF diffusion can help to tackle drug targets that have proved challenging, such as G protein-coupled receptors, membrane proteins that help control a cell's responses to external chemicals. But the antibodies that RF diffusion churned out are a long way from reaching the clinic. The designer antibodies that did work didn't bind to their targets particularly strongly. An antibody used therapeutically would also need its sequences modified to resemble natural human antibodies so as not to provoke an immune reaction. The designs are also what's known as single-domain antibodies, which resemble those found in camels and sharks, rather than the more complex proteins that nearly all approved antibody drugs are based on. These types of antibodies, yeah, it should be antibodies, not antibody, are easier to design and simpler to study in a lab, and it makes sense to design these first, says Dean. But it doesn't take away from it being a step on the way to the kinds of methods we need. This is proof of principle work, Watson stressed. stresses, but he hopes the initial success will pave the way for designing antibody drugs at the touch of a button. It feels like quite a landmark moment. It really shows this is possible. And this is the final thing I want to conclude on. Whoops, I didn't scroll down, didn't I? This is the final thing that I want to conclude on, and you can see the preprint is linked here, so I encourage you to go have a look at it. Just because something is possible doesn't make it good to do. That is, again, where the ethical considerations come in, and unfortunately, this article really didn't get into it. Here, what is the ethical considerations of doing something like this? And that is what I would like to see more of, and unfortunately, STEM really doesn't seem to have reckoned with it, but just seems to have gone for it. Now, obviously, biology and medicine are not responsible themselves for creating AI, but at the same time, you know, AI is a creation of STEM generally, science, technology, engineering, and math. And so it is important to recognize that now that this thing exists as a product of the many things that STEM has done, we have to reckon with the ethics of it. And this is more than a little concerning that it's not being considered with regards to something like this. And I don't know that I would really be interested in an antibody drug that's created with AI. It's not one I've had to take for my particular medical needs when I've been sick. It's not one that I've ever had to take, that type of drug, but I don't know that I would trust that, to be truthful. And again, I ask the question, you know, let's say you design it, but it's also a model. And what if it's even a little bit wrong? What happens? What goes wrong with that kind of situation? I don't think that's being thought about here, and there needs to be some ethics guidelines for this for sure if you're going to be using this kind of stuff in a medical setting, most definitely. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.